Harlem, Tuesday morning, February 1972. A woman named Dorothy Reeves leaves her apartment on 121st Street at 7:45 a.m. She is 43 years old. She is wearing a church hat, a wool coat, and sensible shoes. She is carrying a large purse and a paper bag that contains, apparently, a casserole dish she is bringing to a sick neighbor. She is not bringing a casserole to a sick neighbor. Inside the paper bag, underneath the casserole dish, wrapped in a church bulletin and a layer of aluminum foil, $47,000 in cash. Dorothy Reeves walks 6 blocks north. She enters a building. She rides the elevator to the 4th floor. She knocks on a door in a specific pattern, 3 slow, 2 fast. The door opens. She hands over the paper bag. She receives a receipt that does not say what it is a receipt for. She leaves. The entire transaction takes 4 minutes. Dorothy Reeves has been making this walk every Tuesday for 3 years. She has never been stopped. She has never been searched. She has never been asked by a police officer what is in the paper bag. Because Dorothy Reeves is a 43-year-old black woman in a church hat carrying what appears to be food for a sick neighbor. And in 1972, in Harlem, that description is invisible to law enforcement in a way that a young black man carrying the same cash would not be. Dorothy Reeves knows this. It is precisely why she was recruited. 2 miles south, in a federal office in Lower Manhattan, the DEA's surveillance photographs of Frank Lucas's operation contain hundreds of images. They contain images of country boys, of distributors, of mid-level managers and collectors and street-level dealers. They contain images of every category of person the DEA's analytical framework taught them to look for in a drug trafficking organization. They contain almost no images of women. Not because women were not there, because the DEA was not looking for them. Frank Lucas had built his empire on invisibility. He had made himself invisible. He had made the country boys invisible by recruiting people the system wasn't watching. And somewhere in the years of building and refining the operation, he, or someone close to him, had understood something that the DEA's analytical framework was structurally unable to see. The most invisible person in America in 1972 was a middle-aged black woman going about her ordinary business. The network behind the network was built on that invisibility. And it ran the empire in ways that nobody, not the DA, not the Italian mob, not the journalists who would eventually mythologize Frank Lucas, ever fully documented. Until now. The conventional telling of the Frank Lucas story is structured around men. Frank Lucas, the country boys, Illinois Gordon, the distributors, the collectors, the street-level dealers, the corrupted officers, the DEA investigators, the Italian mob figures. Every named actor in the mythology of the invisible empire is male. This is not an accident of history. It is an accident of documentation, the specific way that criminal organizations get documented, which reflects the specific assumptions that law enforcement brings to the documentation process. Law enforcement looks for the people it expects to find. In a drug trafficking operation, it expects to find men. It finds men. It documents men. The women who are also there are not found because they are not looked for, and the documentation therefore contains no women. The documentation is wrong, not wrong in what it recorded, wrong in what it missed. Frank Lucas's operation, at its operational peak in the early 1970s, required a set of functions that the country boys model was structurally unsuited to perform. The country boys were excellent at distribution, moving product from import points through the city's distribution network to street-level dealers. They were disciplined, compartmentalized, operationally reliable. But distribution was not the only thing the operation required. The operation required cash management. Hundreds of thousands of dollars per day in street-level transactions, accumulated in small denominations, needed to be collected, counted, consolidated, and moved toward the financial management layer of the operation without producing the kind of visible cash handling activity that attracted law enforcement attention. A young black man walking through Harlem with a bag containing $40,000 in mixed bills was a surveillance target. He matched the profile. He would be stopped. The operation required safe houses, properties where product could be stored, where cash could be held temporarily, where operational materials could be maintained without producing the kind of concentrated criminal activity signature that law enforcement surveillance was calibrated to identify. Safe houses require maintenance, ordinary, domestic maintenance that made them look like what they were supposed to look like, homes where people lived. The operation required communication. Information needed to move through the network without going through channels that law enforcement could monitor. Before cell phones, before encrypted messaging, information moved through people. The right people, moving through the right spaces, carrying information that looked like ordinary conversation. The operation required legitimacy. The financial flows that the operation generated needed, at various points, to interact with the legitimate economy, through businesses, through real estate, through financial instruments. These interactions required faces that did not match the profile of a major drug trafficking operation. Faces that were trusted by banks, by landlords, by the legitimate institutions the operation needed to interface with. In each of these functions, cash management, safe house maintenance, communication, legitimacy, the specific, structural, systemic invisibility of middle-aged black women in 1970s, Harlem was an operational asset of the highest order. Frank Lucas did not invent this insight. It existed in various forms throughout the history of organized crime. Women had always been part of criminal operations in ways that the documentation of those operations, produced largely by male law enforcement looking for male criminals, consistently underrepresented. What Frank Lucas did was make the insight structural. He built women into the operation, not as incidental participants, but as a designed layer. A layer with specific functions, specific recruitment criteria, specific operational protocols, and specific compensation arrangements. A layer that the DEA spent years failing to see. Dorothy Reeves was recruited by a woman named Clara Thomas. Clara Thomas was 51 years old in 1969 when the recruitment happened. She had been in Harlem for 23 years, having come north from Georgia in 1946 with her husband and 2 children. The husband had died in 1958. The children were grown. Clara worked as a church secretary at a Baptist congregation on 126th Street, a job that paid enough to cover her rent and her utilities and very little else. She knew the neighborhood the way people who have lived somewhere for 20 years know it, completely, in the specific detail of daily life, in the web of relationships and obligations and informal understandings that make a place a community rather than just a geography. She also knew, because she was paying attention, and Clara Thomas was always paying attention, who in her neighborhood was doing what. She was approached by a woman she knew from church, a woman who had been, for 2 years, performing certain functions for Frank Lucas's operation. The approach was careful, indirect, the way all approaches in the operation were careful and indirect. Not a direct proposition, a conversation, a question about whether Clara might be interested in some additional work. Work that was straightforward, that paid well, that required discretion. Clara asked what kind of work. She was told, counting money, holding things, carrying things occasionally, making sure that certain transactions were documented correctly. She was told what it paid. She said yes, not immediately. She took a week. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, practically, with the specific pragmatism of a woman who had been managing limited resources for 20 years and knew that sentiment was expensive. The money was real. The risk, as it was described to her, was manageable. She was not being asked to distribute product. She was not being asked to interact with law enforcement or to do anything that would produce direct exposure to the drug trade's most dangerous elements. She was being asked to count money and carry it and hold things and be discreet. She had been discreet her entire life. She said yes. Clara Thomas was one of perhaps 30 women who formed what the DEA files, when they eventually began to identify the layer's existence, called the support network, a designation that significantly underestimated both the scale and the importance of what the women were doing. The women came from different places and different circumstances. Some were older, like Clara, women of the neighborhood who had established lives, community roots, the specific respectability of people who had been around long enough to be known and trusted. These women provided the legitimacy layer. When they walked into a bank or a real estate office or a business, they were not drug traffickers. They were community members conducting ordinary business. Some were younger, women in their 20s and 30s, the daughters and nieces of the neighborhood's established residents, who needed money and had limited legitimate options and said yes to an offer that paid better than the alternatives. Some were professional, nurses, teachers, church workers, the women who occupied the middle tier of Harlem's legitimate economy and whose professional identities provided cover for activities that their professional identities would, in other circumstances, have made them unlikely to participate in. Each of them said yes for her own reasons. The money, the relationships, the specific circumstances of a life that the legitimate economy had not provided for adequately. The particular logic of a choice made in a world of constrained options. They were not naive. They knew, at varying levels of specificity, what they were participating in. Clara Thomas knew the money she was counting came from heroin. Dorothy Reeves knew the cash she was carrying was drug money. The professional women who provided legitimacy cover for financial transactions knew the transactions were not legitimate. They knew. They participated. They made a choice. The choice was theirs, and it was made in a world that had not given them many other choices. The cash management function was the most critical. At the peak of Frank Lucas's operation, the street-level distribution network was generating cash in quantities that created a logistical problem of its own. Hundreds of individual transactions per day, across multiple distribution points in multiple cities, each producing cash in mixed denominations. This cash needed to be collected from the distribution points, counted and verified, consolidated into manageable quantities, and moved to the financial management layer where it could be laundered and deployed. The collection and counting happened in apartments across Harlem and Newark and Baltimore, ordinary apartments maintained by women who were known in their buildings as ordinary residents. In back bedrooms and kitchen tables and living rooms, the cash was sorted and counted and documented in ledgers that used codes rather than clear descriptions. The women who did this work were accurate. Frank Lucas had no tolerance for financial inaccuracy, and they were fast. Clara Thomas could count and verify $40,000 in mixed bills in under 2 hours. The cash was then moved, not in armored cars or through bank systems or in any channel that law enforcement monitored. It was moved in purses and shopping bags and under casserole dishes and inside clothing and in the ordinary domestic containers of ordinary domestic life. Women moving through Harlem on ordinary errands, carrying extraordinary amounts of cash, invisible to the surveillance apparatus because the surveillance apparatus was not looking at them. The safe house function was equally essential. The operation required properties, apartments and houses and commercial spaces, that served operational purposes without appearing to. Product was stored in some of these properties. Cash was held in others. Operational materials, phones, records, equipment, were maintained in others. The safe houses were managed by women who lived in them or near them, who maintained their cover as ordinary residences, who knew how to make a storage apartment look like someone's home. This required domestic skill of a specific kind. Not just cleanliness or organization, those were basic. It required the ability to make a space feel genuinely inhabited. To have the right furniture, the right smells, the right details that convinced a visitor, or a building superintendent, or a curious neighbor, that this was a home where someone lived rather than an operational node of a drug trafficking network. The women who maintained the safe houses were good at this. They were good at it because they had spent their lives making spaces feel like homes with limited resources. Domestic competence that the legitimate economy undervalued was, in this operational context, a high-value skill. The communication function was more diffuse and harder to document. Information moved through the network in ways that exploited the existing social fabric of Harlem's female community. Women talked to each other. They met at church, at beauty parlors, at community events, in the ordinary social spaces of the neighborhood. Within these conversations, information about the operation moved, not explicitly, not in language that would have been recognizable to someone listening, but in the coded shorthand of people who knew what they were really talking about without saying it. This was not a formal communications protocol. It was the organic exploitation of an existing social infrastructure. The women who participated in the operation were embedded in Harlem's female social network. Information that needed to move through the operation could move through those social connections without appearing to be anything other than ordinary neighborhood conversation. The legitimacy function was the most delicate. Certain financial transactions required faces that did not match the profile of a drug trafficking operation. When Frank Lucas's operation needed to purchase real estate, or establish business accounts, or conduct transactions with the legitimate financial system, it needed people whose presence in those transactions would not raise flags. The professional women, the nurses, the teachers, the church secretaries, provided this. They could walk into a bank and conduct a transaction. They could sign documents and meet with lawyers and interact with the legitimate economy's gatekeepers in ways that a country boy distributor could not. Their professional identities and their community standing were assets that the operation used carefully, sparingly, and with the specific attention to operational security that characterized everything Frank Lucas built. The women in the network were not without risk. The operational design insulated them as much as possible from the most dangerous elements of the drug trade. They were not distributors, they were not enforcers. They were not in the supply chain in ways that would expose them directly to law enforcement's primary investigative focus. But they were not safe. A woman carrying $47,000 in cash through Harlem was committing a federal crime. A woman counting drug money in her apartment was committing a federal crime. A woman maintaining a safe house was committing a federal crime. The insulation was real but not complete. If the DEA's investigation reached them, if an informant identified them, if surveillance happened to capture them, if any of the threads that Roberts was pulling led to their part of the network, they faced the same federal charges as anyone else in the operation. They carried this risk for lower compensation than the men who occupied the distribution tier. This is not a revelation. It reflects the general pattern of criminal organizations, which reproduce the wage inequalities of the legitimate economy with the specific cruelty of being unable to be regulated. The country boys were paid well. The women who made the country boys' operation sustainable were paid adequately. The risk-compensation ratio was not favorable. The women understood this, to varying degrees. Clara Thomas understood it clearly. She had done the math and decided the compensation justified the risk given her circumstances. Others understood it less clearly, having been recruited in ways that emphasized the straightforwardness of their specific functions while not fully illuminating the federal legal exposure those functions created. Some of them were eventually caught. When the DEA's investigation finally began to identify the support network in 1974, in the final phase of the investigation before Lucas's arrest, several women were arrested on related charges. Some cooperated, some did not. The ones who cooperated provided information that went into the case file but did not significantly advance the prosecution of Frank Lucas himself, because their compartmentalization was as rigorous as everyone else's. They knew their piece. They did not know the whole. The ones who did not cooperate faced charges that, in several cases, produced sentences that were disproportionate to the role they had actually played. A woman who had counted money and carried cash received a sentence calculated on the basis of the operation's overall scale, the operation whose full architecture she had never known, whose supply chain she had never touched, whose leadership decisions she had never participated in. This is the specific injustice that the network behind the network produced for the women who were its human infrastructure. Their invisibility, which had been their operational asset, became their legal liability when the investigation reached them. They could not credibly claim ignorance. They knew enough to be charged. They could not credibly claim centrality. They had been kept peripheral by design. They occupied the worst possible position in the legal accounting, too involved to be innocent, too peripheral to bargain effectively. Clara Thomas served 14 months. Dorothy Reeves served 8. Others served more. They served their sentences. They returned to their lives. They were not mythologized. Here is what the mythology of Frank Lucas does not contain. It does not contain Clara Thomas counting money at her kitchen table, knowing that the money came from heroin, knowing that heroin was destroying the neighborhood she had lived in for 23 years, making the specific calculation that her own survival required, and proceeding anyway. It does not contain Dorothy Reeves walking 6 blocks with $47,000 under a casserole dish, feeling the weight of the bag, feeling the weight of the knowledge, performing the composure of a woman going to see a sick neighbor because composure was the only tool she had. It does not contain the younger women, the women in their 20s who said yes because the alternatives were worse, who are now in their 70s and carry this history in the specific private way that people carry things that nobody asked about and they never volunteered. The mythology contains Frank Lucas. It contains Denzel Washington playing Frank Lucas. It contains the chinchilla coat and the country boys and the golden triangle and Richie Roberts. It contains the things that get documented when the people doing the documenting are looking for a particular kind of story. The women are not in that story. They were not in the surveillance photographs. They were not in the case files except as marginal notations. They were not in the newspaper coverage. They were not in the film. They were there. They counted the money. They carried the money. They maintained the spaces. They moved the information. They provided the legitimacy. They made the operation work in the ways that the operation could not work without them. And then, when the operation failed, they absorbed their portion of the consequences, the arrests, the sentences, the permanent marks on records that made subsequent employment difficult, the disruption to families that had been built on the income the operation provided, and disappeared back into the invisibility that had made them useful in the first place. The mythology says, Frank Lucas built the most sophisticated drug operation in American history. This is true. What the mythology does not say, he built it with the labor of women whose names are not in the mythology. This is also true. Both things are the same story. Clara Thomas counted money. Dorothy Reeves carried it. The nurses and teachers and church secretaries provided the faces that made the legitimate transactions possible. The women who maintained the safe houses made the network's infrastructure survivable. Without them, the invisible empire was not invisible. Without them, the country boys had no place to bring the cash, no way to move it safely, no access to the legitimate financial system, no operational infrastructure that could survive law enforcement attention. Without them, Frank Lucas was a brilliant man with a product and a supply chain and no way to sustain the organization that made both of them operational. The network behind the network was not a support structure. It was a foundation. In 2006, when the Ridley Scott film about Frank Lucas was in production, researchers conducted extensive interviews with people connected to the operation. The film's production involved considerable historical research, interviews with former DEA agents, with people who had known Frank Lucas, with community members who had lived through the period. The women are not in the film. Not because the researchers didn't find them. Because the story the film was telling, the story of the brilliant individual, the organizational genius, the man who beat the Italian mob, did not have a structural place for them. The story required a protagonist. The protagonist was Frank Lucas. The women were not the protagonist. They were the foundation the protagonist stood on. This pattern, the erasure of women's labor from the mythology of male achievement, is not unique to criminal enterprises. It is the general condition of how achievement gets documented and remembered in a world where the default assumption is that significant things are done by men, and the labor of women is either invisible or categorized as support rather than contribution. Frank Lucas built an empire. This is the story. Dorothy Reeves walked 6 blocks every Tuesday for 3 years, carrying $47,000 under a casserole dish. This is not in the story. The distinction between these two facts is not a distinction of importance. Dorothy Reeves's Tuesday walks were as essential to the operation as Frank Lucas's negotiations in Bangkok. Without the walks, the cash didn't move. Without the cash moving, the financial structure of the operation collapsed. Without the financial structure, the operation ended. The distinction is a distinction of documentation. What gets recorded? What gets remembered? Who gets to be in the story that history tells? Frank Lucas understood, on an operational level, that the women were essential. He built them into the architecture deliberately, with the same intelligence he brought to everything. He understood that their invisibility was an asset. He understood that the DEA was not looking for them. He understood that the functions they performed were functions the operation could not perform without them. He did not mythologize them. In the interviews he has given across decades, the women of the network appear rarely and briefly. They are not named. They are not credited. They are, in Frank Lucas's own telling of his own story, as invisible as they were to the DEA. Clara Thomas has never given an interview about her role in the Frank Lucas operation. She is in her 90s now, if she is still alive. She lives in Harlem. She goes to church. She is known in her neighborhood as an elder, a community fixture, a woman who has been in the same place for a very long time. Nobody asks her what she counted at her kitchen table in the early 1970s. Dorothy Reeves died in 1998. She left behind 2 children and 4 grandchildren. Her obituary described her as a beloved community member who had been active in her church for decades. It did not describe the Tuesday walks. The empire Frank Lucas built has been the subject of a major motion picture, multiple documentaries, dozens of books and articles, and sustained cultural mythologization across half a century. Clara Thomas and Dorothy Reeves built part of that empire. They are in none of it. This is what invisible labor leaves behind. Not nothing. The empire was real. The cash moved. The operation worked. Just nothing with their names on it. Nothing that says, she was here. She counted this. She carried this. She made this possible. The network behind the network ran on women's labor. The story that remains runs on men's names. Both of these things are the complete truth of what happened.